Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of the Workplace Navigation Podcast. In these episodes, we bring issues that employees typically face on the workplace, and we solve them. Hopefully, this information would apply to you and you can use it. If you have any comments or experiences that you would like to add, please throw them into the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining. Good day, everybody, and welcome to the Workplace Navigation Podcast. In this episode, we continue with our five-part series discussing why strategy fails on execution within organizations. The five-part contributors are lack of clarity, lack of alignment, lack of prioritization, lack of accountability, and lack of adaptability. In this final episode of this five-part series, Duane Nicholson, Chief Transformation Officer, and myself, Program Manager and Writer, discuss how lack of adaptability contributes to strategy failure and execution. One thing I'd say at the beginning is if we say strategy is a hypothesis about the future, execution is where hypothesis meets reality, and we can define adaptability as what we do when these two do not match. So, Duane, what are your thoughts on this key contributor to strategy failure?
Well, yeah. So when I think of adaptability, the thing that pops in my head is big room planning when it comes to safe. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept, but you pull everyone into the same room and then you talk about what you're going to do over the next 10 to 12 weeks. And uh, a lot of times in those sessions, there's like this rigid mentality of some individuals, at least the first time you do any type of big room planning. And there's this mentality that you can't move forward because you can't think about things in 12 weeks and things may change. So that's the analysis paralysis there. It's like I can't predict everything that will happen. So because of it, I'm not going to do anything. So you see how that flexibility there is. I'm not sure how to actually move forward because I can't anticipate what's happening in the future, as opposed to embracing the potential that things could change. But for right now, I'm going to act on what I know. And then as things progress, I'm going to adapt accordingly. So that's the thing that pops into my head when I think about adaptability. And I think that or should I say, in my experience, what we've done is in order to break the chains of the mind and get people to start thinking about changes is going to happen, and here is how we're going to treat those changes. Once that's clear and people are aware that things will change, then what happens is they become comfortable with creating and planning for the long term because they realize there's a mechanism in place for accepting change or allowing for that adaptability. Does that
You know,
make sense?
yeah, you mentioned SAFE, and I'm glad you did. I've been in several organizations that were employing SAFE, which means Scaled Agile Framework, if anyone doesn't know what that means. But a bunch of Scrum teams get together in SAFE, a bunch of teams, a bunch of value streams get together, and they talk about what they're doing. And these big meetings that you were talking about is where everybody gets together. But there's some important meetings that happen on the side. And those meetings, we called it speed dating, where dependencies would be listed on a post-it somewhere. And you would go to those rooms where you were listed as a dependency and you would negotiate your resources with them and
Right.
timing. And that's about, I think you were alluding to knowledge. We need knowledge about that. And one of the reasons that adaptability kills strategy is because of these assumptions that we make in a safe environment. You might think everything is safe. You're being taken care
Hmm.
of, but you're
Right.
not because you need to understand what those assumptions are. Customers behaving in a certain way, technology performing as expected, competitors responding predictably, organizations execute according to plan, and vitally, resources remain available and even understand that they're needed. And so, to your point, we need knowledge. We need that knowledge.
Right.
And, and that even extends past safe. But what's your feeling about that?
Right. So when you say knowledge, let's kind of frame that up because when I'm saying knowledge, I'm saying a contingency plan.
Mhm.
Uh, People need to have things structured in a way that lets them know things can change because a lot of times, let's go back in the day when we used to do projects and we planned them for an entire 3 years. Then what would happen is, I remember working on a workflow effort where it took them 1 year to write the business requirements. Then after writing those business requirements, we actually, started working on the application. And then what happened? In that year, everything changed on how they actually worked. And it's a workflow system. So what happened is as we're moving through and developing different components of the system, things had to change to match their new workflow system. And so, how do we deal with that? Well, had to put in some type of change management process to ensure that, hey, you know what? We understand that business requirements were written a certain way. However, this is the way the team works. And being able to have a regular system where we meet and we talk about what the system is doing today versus what was written in the business requirements, and this is how we're going to change them. And so, as a technology team, having that regular forum to meet with the business and get things approved and come up with a method for actually incorporating that into the documentation and at the same time sending the developers on their way to complete and then making sure that QA knows, okay, this is what the expected outcome is. That process is the most important thing. And that's what I mean by contingency plan. We need
Mhm.
to understand what in order for people to truly function in an environment where you're doing long-term planning, they need to have something in their minds that helps them go, things could change, and this is how it changes before they can truly release and pull together their creative minds and think beyond the next 2 weeks. And so when we talk about big room planning or the breakout sessions that you mentioned, when you're in those breakout sessions, you want them thinking beyond the next 2 weeks, beyond the next month, and in some cases pushing out to that 3 months. That's difficult for most people to think in that long-term planning. And so to me, having that plan or a method of dealing with change is what frees the mind in order for you to get the creative juices needed to complete the planning.
So in a waterfall methodology, you typically go through, all the stages and then you get to the end and after the project is finished, you would do what's called lessons learned.
Right,
Lessons learned. And then you would take those lessons learned and file it never to be looked at again. But in Agile, though, we have a similar thing where you do sort of a retrospective, right? And
right,
you say, what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we, continue to do? And so that's kind of a lessons learned too. But in what I'm gleaning from what you're saying is that adaptability would mean that we would be doing lessons learned continually
right,
and actually building change or adaptability into our process. That's a
right,
step that we can't, we should look for change. We should look for what we need to change constantly, just like one would look at risk. You
right,
can't determine a risk and then never visit it again. You need
right,
risk is a malleable thing. It's continually changing all the parameters that go into risk. So you're continually looking at risk. See, is that risk still there? Is it worse? Is the impact worse? Is it better? Do we mitigate it in a different way? And so on. Same with adaptability and change. You would
Right.
continually look at your plan to see if you need to adapt, if you need to change, and that's part of the process.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, bringing in the retro. Um, do you remember what we called um, the lessons learned before it was called lessons learned?
No, I don't.
Post-mortem.
Postmortem, right? Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah, you
Exactly. I
remember that,
forgot about,
right?
yeah, it's such an uplifting thing,
So so the project's dead. It's over. So
Yeah.
it made sense. You go lessons learned, but it's too late. And so there was no adaptability there. And so I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought that up because it does remind us that, the retrospective, it does give you that opportunity to make change. And it's also built in. So again, a mechanism for being able to make changes and make those changes early, as opposed to waiting till the end of the project and you're going, oh, well, everyone's been on that nightmare project, where you need like a whole month off, uh, because you're exhausted from the project. So this gives you an opportunity rather than getting, burnt out from the project through the entire thing. You have an opportunity to go, look, this is an adaptability checkpoint. And you go, hey, we're doing this great, but not so good at this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then what actions are we going to take? And so that's another thing that's important is taking action. Now, a lot of people have retrospectives and then they do, the insanity move, which is they keep doing the same things over and over again, expecting this, different
Yeah.
results. So,
Well, I
yeah.
could see two reasons why people would not want to act. One would be risk. There's risk
Hmm.
there in acting. And second would be accountability.
Right.
You have to
Yeah.
own up
And
to what failed.
yeah. And we
Yeah.
talked about accountability, but I think that risk is one of these things. Risk always comes up. And I think organizations, teams are good at identifying risk. Or should I say, organizations are good at risk, but teams are not good at identifying risk. So, um, in my perspective, what I've seen is they're not able to see those risks. Uh,
Well, I think I
and
agree. I agree with you, but with one exception, Dwayne. I think they're good
please,
at identifying risk. I think they're not so good at identifying impact or severity of the
yes,
risk. Okay.
right,
I'll give
and
you an
that,
example. When COVID first came, it was early in 2020, and I identified a risk at a place that said COVID could present a high risk to us. Not
right,
because at the time it was considered probable, but the impact of that risk was so devastating that it had to be considered a severity. Okay, and it was ignored. They said because of the low probability, it's just a low risk. And then COVID hit, and it was incredibly impactful, turned
right,
everything upside down. So the severity side of the risk is
right,
probability times impact. Okay, so same with other elements that go into determining how adaptable you are. I'm sorry, please
right.
go for it.
No, I was thinking about that because I think that's definitely, and that's exactly where I was going because I think that identifying the risk is easier for organizations like leadership. Teams don't necessarily, in my opinion, and based on the experience that I've had, I don't see teams. They're difficult. They have difficulty identifying the risk. So now we're talking about identification. Now the next thing is, okay, now that you've identified the risk, okay, what do you do with it? So
Yeah,
one component that you brought up, which is, what's the probability of this situation occurring? Okay. And then impact, right? So using those two components and then really weighing those components like, okay, well, low probability, low impact. Okay, well, like you said, you do nothing with it. Well, then, you know, if it's high impact and high probability, uh-oh, we've got a bigger problem. Let's go ahead and dive into that. So that part, that secondary step, I think that so the first part is 50-50. Then now it even gets worse once you step into this realm of identifying what that probability and impact is. And then the other thing is the next component is at what point will we identify that this situation has occurred? When are you past the point of it's a risk versus an issue? That is where I see most teams uh, getting caught up is they can't find out where that window is. Is
Mhm.
it like you said, with COVID, what's the date? What date can you truly identify, okay, that you've been impacted? And
Mhm.
I think to myself, perfect example of working on a large effort, and we were all of a sudden, because of COVID, what started happening is we started losing resources, or
Mhm.
we can't call them resources anymore. We started losing team members. Why?
Mhm.
Because at that particular time, team members, when everyone was restricted to being on site, and then all of a sudden it became okay to be remote. So what
Mhm.
happened is we had contracts with offshore teams, and these
Mhm.
offshore teams, we were paying X for a rate for an offshore team person. Well, they were being offered double. And so they were being offered double to go to different organizations. And so what happened is we started losing team members.
Because
And as
because
we
of,
started,
was that because of the acceptance of remote work, you're saying?
exactly, it
Okay,
became
gotcha.
it
Gotcha.
became the norm.
Yes,
And so
right.
because it became the norm, all of a sudden the demand shift. So
Yeah.
in economics, I mean, this is the demand shift, right? It changed. It's the labor curve changed, right? And it shifted. And so because that labor curve shifted, it shifted the price of what it costs for, offshore team members to work. So this is a huge thing. So I brought this up to my president, and when I brought it up, she was like, "Okay, we should bring this up when we go and we talk to the CEO." And so we brought it up, and then I remember everyone goes, I brought this risk up because I'm working on one component of a larger project. There's, modernization that's happening across the entire organization, and I have my own small or division that I'm focusing on, and I bring it up. Well, guess what? Everyone was goes, "Oh, that's not a big issue. We're not facing this issue." Well, guess
Mhm.
what? I gave them the insight to go,
Mhm.
"Hey, we're experiencing these issues," and it turns out the VMO had just told all these vendors, "We're capping you off on your costs." So the combination of the two, meaning you've got one situation, which was we don't have people because they're dropping off. And what exacerbated the issue was the VMO was saying we're putting cap we're saying you can only charge us this amount of money. This is what the VMO is dictating. They didn't necessarily jive. So now we've got this maximum cost that the VMO is wants these vendors to adhere to, plus people are getting offered more money in different places. Guess what that does? It creates this vacuum of talent. So I had to bring up this risk and have it addressed. But I never knew that this was going to happen. So when we think about impacts of COVID, we didn't know that was the thing. That
Yeah.
risk became an issue really quick. And how we had to adapt to that particular situation was we had to go talk to the VMO. They had to work through things. They had to redo everything that they were doing. And at the
Mhm.
same time, we had to bring on new vendors
Mhm.
because of the lack of, because our current vendors, they weren't able to supply or give us enough supply of talent in order to make it happen. And so we had to change from that. So that risk, like you said, became like the COVID risk was too nebulous. And so identifying the true impact wasn't there. And that was one impact. And I'm sure there were many during that particular time.
Well, I'd like to point out two things. First of all, that's an example of not being able to identify impact of a risk
Right.
that I see all the time.
Yes.
But behind that, Duane, before that happens, there's something that we call a trigger. And the
Hmm.
trigger is the indicator that that risk is going to be realized at some point.
Exactly.
And we don't identify triggers either. So
Yeah.
two things. We don't identify impact properly, which means that we haven't identified the severity properly to know that how high on the totem pole that risk is and how much attention we should give to it. And we don't identify triggers that would indicate when that risk is coming so we could become prepared. And both of those present potential disaster for a project. But before we continue on with this, I wanted to bring up a couple of obstacles of adaptability and get your opinion or your comments on it. What I see is, first of all, there's an annual plan trap. We put together an annual plan. How have you seen that affect adaptability?
Right. Yeah. We covered this is we have this annual plan and we don't revisit that annual plan. And so right now, I'm going to date this is that we're in Q3 and people are gearing up for annual planning for Q4 in many organizations, not all. And so what happens is you have this ideal plan, but just like a project itself is you have this great plan, but then 30 days into the project, something else new comes in. There's a new shiny toy. And so what do we talk? We talked about alignment. What happens is there's going to be change. How do you deal with that change? That adapt to the change itself. So what's the problem with annual planning? There's nothing wrong with annual planning because you go, hey, this is what we plan to do. But again, you have to bake in some type of change. When a is change is going to happen, right? We always say change is inevitable. What does that mean? So
Mm,
that means that you need to know that, hey, when change happens, what do we do? In project management or, PMP practices, what do? You have a change management plan in place. Well, there's usually no change management plan. When you do annual planning, they're like, look, here's a budget. This is what we said we were going to do. But did we have something in place that goes, one, we're going to be checking for change. And then two, what happens, what we, what happens if there is change. And I think that there's those two components that need to be there for annual planning trap and not assuming that, hey, we've got to stay the course. We need to be able to adapt to what market conditions. We need to, it's labor. There's so many different components that impact a annual plan, and there's so many conditions that can impact. And we talked about COVID, but there's so many things happening right now. We look at AI and how it's impacting workers. That worker who's with you, who right now, today, in 3 to 6 months, will that worker be sitting next to you? And how do you adapt to that change?
mhm.
Is that person's work covered? You know?
Okay, second item. Thank you. Sunk cost, sunk cost thinking. How does that affect adaptability in your
Right.
mind? Mhm,
So yeah, when I think of sunk costs, it again, this goes back to mindset. Most people think I've already spent 3 million and so because I spent 3 million, I need to or I invested 3 million, I need to figure out if I'm going to spend another 3 million to keep this project going. Uh, how much does it cost? Who cares about what you spent? You really have to go today. in order to cross the line, I need to spend, we originally said we were going to spend 10 million. And then I need an additional 5 million to get it over the line. The question is like, how confident are we that we can get it over the line in the time that we originally said and with this additional cost? Or does that mean we can shorten up the timeline by spending more money? We need to ask these questions based on what we know today versus what happened in the past. And I think that that is key is making that decision independent of the costs that are there, and also having points in place where you go, look, when this is off the rails, when you're 3 months into the project and you spent 50% of the budget, what are the insights that you have in place that are letting you know that, hey, we're off the rails and we need to have a checkpoint and have a discussion about, okay, look, this project's off the rails. We're overspent now, but should we continue to overspend
Right,
or do we need to reevaluate?
right. Okay. How about this? Bad news travels slowly upward the chain.
I really think that this is a really important uh, discussion item, and depending on who your leader is, this is something that is really important because you have to create an environment as a leader. You have to create an environment that allows you or allows your team to communicate things that are bad, or teach them how to communicate things that are bad. Because what happens is teams, when it's bad news, they'll stop talking, and they'll stop talking mainly based on the reaction that you have. Why isn't this done? When are we going to get there? When just think about it. It's like it takes you back to middle school all over again when your parents were yelling at you to get your room clean or whatever. That mentality kicks in, and they go back into some type of, I don't know, different state. They stop talking. And once they stop talking, now you're not getting information and it's not flowing. So what you said is things move slowly. That means that someone's going to have to start digging in, and digging in and finding that information takes time. And so when you have that delay in information, then what happens is you have a delay in the decision making, and delay in decision making costs you money. So this reflects back on the sunk cost thinking is that, hey, you're going to sink more money into a bad project because you don't have clear insight into what the team is doing or not doing. And by the time it actually reaches the top, you actually have a bigger problem, because you've created an environment where it's not okay to communicate things that are bad. So
Yeah,
I think it's the onus is on leadership is to create that type of environment and make sure that you're reacting in a way that goes, that's a data point, and then being supportive and responding in a way that goes, thank you for that information. I'll take that information and work with other leaders and come back so that way we can figure out how to help you. That's how I frame it, but I don't know how everyone else is framing it.
yeah, yeah. Okay, how about this one? Misguided metrics. Teams measure completing tasks rather than producing intended results. 100% on schedule, but failing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm trying to think of the term right now, and I'll come back to that. But uh, value. A lot of people think that, like for example, um, oh, velocity. It was escaping me.
Velocity. Hmm.
So, velocity is one of those terms that a lot of, or velocity is something that's used in Agile, but it's one of these things that management loves. How fast are you? They believe that that means how fast are you going? Like, I'm going 50 miles per hour, so I'm getting there faster, right? And and so just because you're getting there faster, let's think about this driving in a car, right? So if you're driving in a car and the speed limit is 35 and you're driving 50 miles per hour, um, what are you doing? You're creating risk, right? Because if it's a 35 mile per hour zone, that probably means it's a residential area. So driving at 50 probably is too fast for what you should be doing. So that's one analogy, but there's so many things wrong with this measurement, which we call velocity. And I think it's a good tool because it kind of helps you if you're in a scrum master or a team leader role, it helps you kind of determine, how are things moving along and kind of gives you an indicator where you might be in the future.
Mhm.
But going back to what you're asking, if you do 100 tasks this sprint and then 50 the next sprint, doesn't matter really at the end of the day. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, it was, oh, I got 50 things done or I got 100 things done. No, at the end of the sprint, you should be able to go, okay, I got this widget done, or this widget is partially done. This widget is fully done. And then how does that contribute to the entire system that you're working on? And most people or most teams, they don't know how to articulate that. And so I think that we get caught up in items or tasks being complete as opposed to what value got delivered. And I think that that's the most important thing is um, being aware of what your metrics are communicating. And it should be communicating outcomes, business outcomes.
I don't know if you've heard this adage from Agile. Today, because of Agile, we're doing the wrong things twice as fast. Anyway, next, governance becomes bureaucratic. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I think that, we talked about this indirectly, and I'm going to get your take on this, is that um, governance, it has a place. And and the reason why I think about this is something I've been working on in the past year or more, is really focusing on governance. And governance is about getting consistency. And so it seems like bureaucracy, but from a communication standpoint, the reason why you want things to be consistent is so then that way you can compare apples to apples. And so when we talk about a flow of information, governance can be something that really helps the team or helps leadership understanding where teams need help. So that's the positive aspect of governance. The opposite of that, which is the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is where teams can't make the decisions that they need to make because they have to wait for someone to make that decision. So they're communicating information in their weekly status or your at the end of your sprint, but it takes a month for someone to get back to you. So that month again is decision latency. And so because of that, that can impact the project and cost more money at the end of the day. So that's my thought. I mean, what are you thinking in your head when you use the word bureaucracy? What were you thinking?
Well, as a, a hardened PM, I found that the change control methodology or methods or process were extremely slow. They
Mm-hmm.
were hard and
Mm-hmm.
not conducive to people bringing honest change.
Right.
They dreaded change control boards. They dreaded it because it became almost an inquisition rather than helpful, you know.
Right.
So I see the governance should be helpful and should be friendly and should be a team thing rather than an adversarial thing. And somebody
Right.
trying to knock down something or gotchas, no gotchas. So that's what I see, that it becomes bureaucratic when it becomes adversarial, I think.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the way I view it. So why don't we close out, Duane? Thank you for all those comments. I appreciate your wisdom and past experience. Um, I see the closing thought this way, that successful strategy execution may not be the result of creating great project plans, but simply learning faster than these plans fail. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to be mobile and to be adaptable, you're you're in a much better spot to be successful. And to determine what success even is, leadership should be clear on the objective, business
Clarity.
outcome, principles, the strategic intent, while remaining flexible about how to get there and not tied to all these things that we'd mentioned before. But what are your closing thoughts?
No, I think you wrapped it up well. And going back to our theme about adaptability is that one, it's okay to make plans. But two, we need to make sure that we have mechanisms in place. You don't have to use the same mechanisms that I have, but having a mechanism that allows for adaptability. So, change control, it still works. The question is how flexible is it, to your point, is and that support. Retros, they allow us to be adaptable. Um, as long as we have a very clear communication from our leadership going, hey, you know what? I'm going to take this information. This is how I'm going to use it. And almost establishing some form of SLA, service level agreement, going, hey, you know what? I got this information. Thank you for this information. One, so being adaptable, going, hey, I realize this is impacting you, and I'm going to get back to you in a certain amount of days, and having that kind of agreement put in place where you say, I'm going to get back to you in 3 days or 5 days or some type of short-term period. I think that's the most important thing is going, getting leadership involved, having some mechanisms, and then understanding, upfront and getting that clear communicated that plans will change and this is how we're going to deal with it.
Excellent. Love it. So, Duane, we decided to do a capstone episode on this to pull all the five parts together and see how they tie. We've mentioned one part when we were talking about another part, so they kind of are intertwined. So we've decided to do a final capstone episode to put all five parts together for summary thought on why a strategy fails in execution. I did want to mention that Duane's contact information will be in the description in case anyone wants to continue on the conversation. And Duane, did you have another initiative you want to talk about that you're doing right now?
I really do want to talk about AIOS,
AIOS.
Intelligence Operating System. And this is something that I've been working on. So that's something that is brewing. So more to come on that. I won't divulge too many details, but it's something that I've been doing on my newsletter called the Delivery Note. And so this is, the beginnings of AIOS. So more to come on that.
Okay, so I'll put that information in the description too, so people can go there if they want to learn more. I'm excited about your AIOS. I can't wait to learn more about it. So thank you, Duane, for joining us today, and great conversation. And we'll talk to you next time.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Mike.
Bye bye.